Thanks. I guess I'm on here, right? Thanks very much for inviting me to talk to you today. I guess not tonight. Tonight you'll be milking cows or something like that. So I have about half an hour here, and I'll try to go as quickly as I can. And basically what I'm going to do is look at a couple of competing systems to supply management. And I've interviewed dairy farmers in Australia and New Zealand, and a couple in the United States as well. I was invited to talk to the Wisconsin Dairy Farmers Union and the National Farmers Organization in the US at the beginning of 2017, which was very interesting. I have to say they're totally in support of supply management, and if they could have it tomorrow, they would. So the National Milk Producers Federation in the US is like the odd person out on this, but they are the evil organization that we have to deal with, I think, in Canada, because they're pushing the NAFTA trade agenda with Trump. So I'll just, as I say, whip through these, and if you have any questions at the end, as I say, hope to do it within half an hour or so. Oh, that's chilled everybody's blood in here. 45 minutes, I don't get chocolate milk, and I had some chocolate milk out there. I love it, I have to say. Anyway, so I'll just set the stage a little bit here with international trade in dairy products is really negligible as a percentage of total global production. So when the Americans and the Europeans and the New Zealanders talk about trade in global dairy products, it's 7% of total production. That's what it is. It's been a fairly consistent number for the past probably 10 to 15 years. It was lower than that before, and it has gone up a little bit, but basically it's about 7% of total global production. And of that 7%, as I say here, 80% of it is occupied by the New Zealand, Australia, the US, and the EU 27 as well. So that means that, I don't know what it is, it works out to something like 1.2% of total global production isn't already accounted for. So if we were ever going to get involved in the export market, which is what, of course, critics like Barry McKenna and John Ibbotson and Martha Hall Findlay talk about, oh, we just got to, I guess there are a lot of dairy farmers in this crowd, we just have to free your inner entrepreneurial spirit and you can kill the world with your dairy exports. There's a tiny, tiny percentage left that we could fill with our dairy, and we are a higher cost producer than, say, the US. The number one dairy state in the United States is California. It's a warm weather environment. Australia, New Zealand, the same kind of thing. And in the European Union, well, I'll talk about this a bit in a second, but basically the European Commission was paying European dairy farmers at the beginning of this year not to produce milk. So, you know, that's what you're up against. You don't get any subsidies now, and if we ever got rid of supply management, you'd have to get subsidies in order to be able to survive. Well, you wouldn't survive, you know, I hate to say that, but you probably wouldn't. Also, dairy's a commodity, you know, peaks and troughs. We've been in the trough phase now since about 2013 or 2014. And when I talk to dairy farmers in New Zealand in particular, they are reeling. They have their national debt, or the dairy farmer debt's gone from $32 billion. I think I have a slide on this a bit later too, so I'm preempting myself here. $32 billion probably in 2014 to $50 billion now. So that leads to a lot of sleepless nights. The National Reserve Bank in New Zealand, which is like their Bank of Canada, is upset about that, worries about the stability of the New Zealand currency because dairy exports are the number one area of expertise and exports. So they're quite concerned about things that are happening. When it's up, it's great. When it's down, well, if you ever farm pigs, you know what the down part is like, I think, for the most part. If there are any pig farmers here, apologies for that. So anyway, I won't go into this. Everybody here knows what supply management's all about. You know, but it seems to me there are a couple of things here I should probably mention. I saw somebody using is it this one? Couple of things here I should just mention quickly, and if you're talking to your MPs or other people, I mean, provincial politicians or municipal politicians, supply management creates lots and lots of jobs in the communities in which it operates, like Elmwood. You know, and I live in Elmira, which is just north of Waterloo. We're like Dairy Central. You know, it's without supply management, we have 5 equipment facilities. We have John Deere, huge John Deere facility. We've got Case International, we have New Holland. You know, there are all sorts of these things around. We would have maybe one small one if we didn't have supply management. So it contributes to rural stability in a way which no other system can. And I think the government actually does know this, but it always is useful if you have an MP or MPP or somebody handy to mention that to them. Environmental impacts are lower as well. You know, when you have a 30,000 cow dairy farm in the Central Valley of California, or Fair Oaks dairy farm in, I think it's Illinois, of 35,000 cows, that environmental impact is fairly staggering. So with us, an average of 75 cows across the country. That's not bad for the most part. Price is also, and I have a quick chart on price, but its competitive milk prices are competitive or cheaper than in other jurisdictions, which flies in the face of commonly accepted wisdom on this. So it's a very sensible, it seems to me, and sustainable system, and I think the government thinks it's very sensible and sustainable as well. So why are we having a conversation about supply management? Well, in large part because the corporate sector doesn't like it. The corporate sector doesn't like anything that has to do with regulation because they're thinking, they regulated milk production, or it is regulated through the Farmer-Controlled Milk Act in Canada, so maybe they're going to regulate us at some point. We really don't want that to happen. So it has to do, neoliberalism is the sort of global organizational model for economic organization that was introduced in the mid-1970s as well. And basically what it focused on, and we really see this since about 1975 or so, free trade, rule of the market, deregulation, which is a big part of that, and we've seen that, say, in the US in particular, not so much in Canada, but in the US, privatization's a big part of it as well. The private sector can do a better job than the state in every instance, which is not true. The state often does things much better than the private sector does. And also it seems eliminating the concept of a public good as a role for government in favor of trickle-down economics. And oddly enough, or staggeringly enough, I guess, the Trump administration's talking about trickle-down economics. I thought it had been declared morally and ethically and economically bankrupt by the mid-1980s, but the Trump guys are talking about, you cut taxes for the billionaires, and they're going to buy more yachts, so that's going to create more yacht construction jobs, I guess, and it's going to trickle down to us at the bottom here. So, as I say, I don't understand the logic for that, but 30% of people in the United States, at a minimum, seem to think that Trump's doing staggeringly, again, a good job. But anyway, so supply management violates every single one of those principles, the articles of faith that's held by big business in Canada. So there's a further context here, but there's a global glut in dairy products now. Of course, there has been since about 2014 as well. China's not buying as much. China's trying to create its own, very quickly going through some of these, trying to create its own dairy industry. They're building supposed to be 100,000 cow farm on the Russia-China border. The Russians will supply the feed for the cows, and then the Chinese will provide the milk. Don't know how they're going to do that, but 100,000 cows is a pretty ambitious dairy farm for sure. Anyway, the wheels fell off the dairy industry, and in particular, when I look at this, the China-New Zealand free trade agreement that was signed in 2008. New Zealand was supposed to supply the Chinese market with all the milk they could take. Can't because the wheels fell off. The Chinese stopped buying. They reduced their purchases from New Zealand by a factor of probably 10. All of a sudden, New Zealand's high and dry. They have all this whole milk powder and skim milk powder they can't get rid of, so the Chinese aren't buying. Anyway, it's a horrible situation for New Zealand, and the Chinese could care less. So that's the danger of free trade agreements as well, which they have. They often don't. It's almost the law of unintended consequences here. The EU got rid of quotas as well. It was on April 1st, 2015. I thought it was kind of an April Fool's joke. At the time, I was actually in Brussels at the time interviewing some European Commission officials connected with the dairy file, which was very interesting. And they just thought Europe was going to unleash farmers' inner entrepreneur as well. So they were really going to go to town on this. Production has soared. They got rid of quotas, no production controls. Production soared, no markets. The markets just collapsed. Part of the reason for the collapse, too, is because the Europeans embargoed trade with Russia in agricultural products as well. Russia did that whole thing in Ukraine, which meant that the Europeans are going to teach the Russians a lesson. They stopped trading in dairy products, and Russia was the EU 27's largest dairy customer. All of a sudden, they have hundreds of thousands of tons of unsold product, and the Russians just get it from someone else. They don't care. The Australians are selling the Russians butter now instead of the Europeans. So anyway, all of this happens. Again, the Europeans think they're doing something that's probably really good. Turns out to be absolutely disastrous for their own economy as well. And they've never recovered from that. So they get rid of quotas. They impose the Russian embargo about 8 months earlier, and all of a sudden there's no market, nothing for European dairy farmers. So they then look to East Asia, South Asia, anywhere in the world in order to get rid of their massive overhangs of of dairy product, and they're still doing it. They have literally hundreds of thousands of tons of skim milk powder, because butter, of course, has gone up in popularity, that they've had since 2014. They have stocks from 2014, and they simply cannot get rid of them. So they're going to be flogging them around the world at cut rate price, really, really cut rate prices, or highly, subsidized prices, or just give it away, in the global south, so which isn't a good thing either. And New Zealand, it's almost like the New Zealanders sat down and before the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks were in the process of being negotiated happily, they've ended, and we see how it all works out. But it's like the New Zealanders sat down and said to themselves, okay, how could we screw ourselves the biggest through this? And they were really, really successful in that. They were talking about everybody should get into dairy. In fact, they focused on us. I actually debated a guy at the Western Canadian Dairy Seminar who was a private sector consultant that the New Zealand government was sending around the world to talk to people about how we should get rid of any regulation in dairy at all, because they have this idea they're going to export dairy products to Canada. Pretty forlorn hope. But as soon as you encourage others to get into dairy, that means you have less of a market. I never understood that. In fact, I mentioned that at the debate, and then the guy just said, there's dairy for everybody. But as it turns out, the New Zealanders, like I say, shoot themselves in the foot, the arm, the leg, ultimately the head as well. So that really didn't work. So those dairy systems are all exposed, the Europeans, the Americans, because the Americans sort of discovered exports. They're all in difficulty because they're exposed to these forces that emanate from the world trade, from global trade in dairy, and they have no control over it whatsoever. And nobody knows what the future is going to bring. So anybody who tells you we get into dairy exports or the international trade has no idea really what's going to happen about this. So the reason why I look at these other models is because this guy, Jonathan Swift, he wrote it in 1726. He said, nothing is great or little otherwise than by comparison, which seems to me to make a lot of sense. So when people talk about us, our dairy system, and they say, it's bad stuff, supply management, regulation, free farmers, let them do whatever they want to do, they'll become much more efficient and entrepreneurial and that kind of thing. Well then, let's look at how other systems that base themselves on these kinds of ideas actually fare in the world. And what I hope to show is that they don't fare very well for the most part. So New Zealand is the largest dairy exporter in the world. It's a tiny, tiny producer. It produces something like 4% of total global dairy production, but it's the biggest exporter because there are only 4 million New Zealanders, and they have a heck of a lot of cows. They had 8 million cows at one point producing dairy. Of course, their dairy cows aren't as efficient as ours. I think they get about maybe 3,500 kilograms of milk solid a year out of them, whereas, of course, you guys get much, much more out of yours. But it is the largest dairy producer, and a couple of quotes, an industry observer, he said in 2016, you could probably double that for 2017 and 2018, what's going to be going forward. What this guy said, Tony Baldwin, our dairy industry is under serious stress. For most dairy farmers, this is the third consecutive year in which cash coming in is less than cash going out. That's always a good situation to have, I find, to have less money coming in than you have money going out. Debt to cover working capital is climbing. Average return on equity is negative. Highly geared farmers with high costs are facing foreclosure. Now that to me sounds like a model we should all emulate, right? This is the kind of thing which we need to adopt in Canada in order to make you guys way more competitive and efficient than you are now. Of course, I don't really mean that anyway. Debt overhang is about $50 billion in the US, which the New Zealand Reserve Bank worries about. And the New Zealanders cannot compete with the Americans. They can't compete politically. They are the world's lowest cost producer of dairy, but they can't compete politically with the EU 27 or the Americans. So they are floundering because they just think that if we are the world's lowest cost producer, not a problem, we can beat anybody in the world. Well, they can, as long as the rest don't subsidize their farmers, if they're not political reasons for pushing dairy around the world, all sorts of things which the Europeans and the Americans are famous for. So they're under intense competition. Also, there's disappearing social license, and I don't really think this has much resonance yet in Canada. Where Fonterra is the big cooperative, it's the biggest cooperative in New Zealand, and they probably about 85% of New Zealand farmers belong to Fonterra, and it's sort of a private sector sort of cooperative. It's a really funny kind of structure they have. It is farmer owned, but you never know it if you talk to New Zealand dairy farmers. Well, 81% of New Zealand is an urban society, same as Canada, right? So they live in Christchurch or Wellington or Dunedin or Auckland, which is the biggest city. And as I say, there are only 4.5 million of them anyway. So they live in a couple of really, really big cities. And they hate Fonterra, largely because Fonterra and dairy, they call it dirty dairy, because dairy has polluted the environment in New Zealand to the point where it's almost irremediable. Mediable. You can't, it's almost beyond the point where you can clean it up. So lakes, rivers, nitrate pollution in water because of cows. It's a grass-based system, so they need to fertilize it constantly with urea. It gets into the water systems. People in Christchurch, which is a fairly large city, complain now. I mean, it's a big, big, big issue. So this whole thing about social license has disappeared. It's a big, big problem for New Zealand dairy farmers, and they really don't know how to deal with this. I did talk to one guy, and I can't remember the unit, but he said he's a dairy farmer in the Canterbury Plains region, which is just to the west of Christchurch on the South Island, and he was saying that he and 4 of his colleagues, he was running for local council because he said something had to be done in order to deal with the situation that he as a dairy farmer was facing in New Zealand. And he said he and his colleagues got together, farmed the best they could, with the greatest emphasis on environmental issues and consideration for pollution, and the environment was at the top of consideration. And he said what the legislation demanded was that they get to, I can't remember the units, I say, 10 units, whereas the best they could do was 50. So he said, I don't know what we're going to do. As dairy farmers, it's an urban society. The people in the cities have not a clue what happens on the dairy farms, which of course is true. So he said, we're screwed in New Zealand, which may be the case. I don't know how it's going to work out, but they are reducing stocking rates in fields. The average stocking rate in New Zealand is based on production of about 4.2 cows per hectare. What they probably need to get to in order to be environmentally sustainable is 1.8, which they can never do, because if they get to 1.8, basically everybody goes out of business. So they're in a really, really tough situation in New Zealand. This debt overhang, equity negative, all that kind of stuff. It's really horrible. And the important point here is that New Zealanders pay more for milk than we do. So the world's largest producer, the lowest cost producer, and in New Zealand, milk is about 1/3 more than it costs here. So again, this is a really great model, that people say we should adopt. I mean, it's absolutely nutty, basically. So the cost, when you normalize it for 4 liters, they sell them in 2-liter containers in New Zealand, or 3-liter containers. Whoever thought up 3 liters? Actually, people say that about us, 4 liters, and they say, and how do you put it in plastic bags, too? That's ridiculous. But anyway, that's a whole other thing, which we can get into later. But anyway, the cheapest milk in Countdown, which is a New Zealand supermarket, is about $6.28. And ours, you might pay $5 for 4 liters. Most of the time, we pay about $4.30. And there's a huge issue with butter, too. Butter's just crashed through the $10 Canadian mark in New Zealand. And butter's cheaper here. For a kilogram of butter here is cheaper than a kilogram of butter in New Zealand. So again, I don't quite follow the logic of the model, but anyway, they do. I've interviewed probably the most number of dairy farmers in Australia, and I think all of them, without exception, well, maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, are negative about the industry in Australia. And again, Australia is one of those countries that people look at and say, we should copy the Australians. They're really like us. They have the same kind of land mass, they have the same kind of culture, traditions, history, organization, stability, parliament. When you go to Australia, it feels a lot like Canada, except it's a lot warmer for the most part, although they do have those 12 deadly creatures that if they look at you, you die, like brown snakes and all the other things they have rolling around there. But anyway, they deregulated dairy in 2001. I interviewed, I think I mentioned him here, Pat Rowley. He was the guy who led the farmer side of the negotiations with government in 2000, basically starting in 1998. And I talked to him for about 2 hours, and he didn't cry, but he's almost cried. He's about 85 now, so he's certainly older. He said it was all a horrible, horrible mistake, what they did in New Zealand. But there's nothing they could or in Australia, but there really was nothing they could do about it, because the John Howard government, which was a really right-wing government of the day, basically said, we're pulling the plug on quotas and sort of supported life for dairy farmers, and it's all going to be deregulated. And everybody in Australia, on 1 January 2001, the entire system just became a deregulated system, and dairy farmers' troubles really began on the 1st of January 2001. And Pat Rowley, as I say, he was distraught when he talked to me, and this was probably in 2016, so it's 15 years after this all happened. He still feels it really, really sharply. And I think a couple of dairy farmers told me their children wouldn't be getting into dairy, absolutely not. And one was a fifth-generation dairy farmer. He said, just can't do it. There's absolutely no money in this. So it's a horrible, horrible situation. One dairy farmer who milked 2,000 jerseys also, I don't think this is true, but he did say that he thought within 20 years Australians would be starving. And again, Australia is an urban society, the Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, like nobody really lives in the countryside, or very, very few people. So nobody has any sense of what goes on in the countryside or how farmers operate and how they act and what they're supposed to do. So this is all to the downside, and I think we in Canada are beginning to enter this kind of scenario. So it's probably be good if dairy farmers got out and, beat the bushes about what a wonderful job you do and how our animal welfare is top of the list and all that sort of thing. It's another big, big issue that's coming down too. So price in Australia again, they have $1 a litre milk, but there's a consumer backlash now in Australia. In the supermarkets, they talk about a free market. There's no such thing as a free market. The supermarkets are the regulators in Australia. So Coles and Woolworths have driven down the price. They're doing the same thing with eggs now that they did with dairy that started in probably 2012, where they unilaterally say to dairy farmers, okay, you want to sell your milk to Coles or Woolworths, we'll give you 50 cents a litre. And if you say, that's less than my cost of production, they say, okay, find someone else to sell it to, because we're not interested. And there are enough farmers in Australia who have to sell to Coles and Woolworths to sustain the industry. The other thing that's happening in Australia is that Coles and Woolworths are taking over branding, which is where the real money lies. And it's in this kind of area where farmers who used to have their own branded milk, cooperatives perhaps, now have Coles and Woolworths milk. So they lose twice. They sort of lose on the price, they lose on the cost of production, which isn't covered, and they lose on the branding opportunities for their own milk as well. So there's a consumer backlash, and they're willingly paying more money for milk in order to help out Australian dairy farmers, because they're going out of business at a great rate for the most part. So as they say, the lifestyle you ordered is currently out of stock, and that's the situation, I think, for most Australian dairy farmers. One guy, I think I have here, this fellow here, he had a big farm. He and his family had been farming in the Gippsland area of eastern Victoria state, and basically he told me, well, we're going to wait and see and hold on for dear life. Again, that's not a sustainable model, and they go out of business at a great rate in Australia. So one of my also Victoria, Australia respondents, he sort of summarized the dairy situation, that we're being told to get ever bigger, to become more efficient, to produce more milk, to flood the market, to compete with more subsidized regimes, which is exactly what happens. And when I talk to these guys, they'd say to me things like, oh, your farmers must be really mollycoddled, they're really inefficient. And I say, okay, how many of you guys have robots? How many of you guys have the latest technology? How many of you guys have tractors that cost, X number of dollars? And as it turns out, very, very few Australians do, because they aren't as efficient as you guys are. And eventually I began to ask them, what do you mean by efficiency? And they'd say, well, we feed our cows hardly anything. It's a grass-based system in Australia too. Couple of kilograms of supplements maybe a day, but basically we don't feed them anything. That's what they mean by efficiency for the most part. So lowest in, and in a sense, least out. So the U.S., their U.S. is dumping milk. They're not interested in, they talk the free market stuff, but as I say, there's no such thing as a free market. The U.S. is producing way too much milk now, which is the whole problem behind American issues with dairy in particular, and the Trump things as well. And in 2017, this was probably by November, they dumped 76 million gallons. You've seen them, they spread it on fields. I don't know if you have some friends who are in the U.S. who are American dairy farmers, but they spread it on fields, they dump it in lagoons, they throw it in creeks and all sorts of things just to get rid of it, because there's zero market for it in the U.S. So dairy exports is not an easy road, that they talk about in the United States. Their dairy production has gone down their dairy exports have gone down quite considerably, and this is even in the face of significant subsidization by the federal government and also state governments as well. They subsidize American dairy. So U.S. production continues to increase 2 to 3% per year, and big dairies, this is a big dairy thing here, where they pump it out literally into nothing for the most part. And this whole thing, when you go back to Wisconsin, as I say, those farmers that I spoke with were desperate to get supply management because they said it's the only system that works. They weren't covering their cost of production. And this whole thing, this is from yesterday, from 3 January, from the Telegraph Herald, 3 January 2018, this quote, where it says, some Wisconsin dairy experts say farmers should take a closer look at their contracts. Yeah, it's the farmer's fault, for the most part, as an oversupply of milk is straining the market. There has to be some supply management occurring. And this is, sacrilegious in the United States, but that's what they were talking about. But the methodology used has to be well thought through, basically. So they're talking in these kinds of terms in the U.S. because they simply have no markets for the massive amount of milk that's being produced because they have no supply management. And ultimately, of course, even if everybody in a community agrees we're not going to produce more than X number of gallons of milk in the U.S., you only need one person to break that, which is what happens in cooperatives often, where one guy will say, I can do better than that, and away off to the races we are again. And the situation in the United States wasn't so much that, we did stop U.S. exports to Canada, but the biggest issue in this Wisconsin thing that Trump tweeted about was that Wisconsin, the grassland dairy, was actually importing milk from Michigan because Michigan was selling it to them for $5 a hundredweight, which is the cost of production is about $21 a hundredweight. But Michigan dairy farmers were desperate for any market, so they're selling it to Wisconsin dairy farmers, grassland dairy processor, in the hopes that they'd get something out of that. And of course, it drove those, whatever it was, 75 Wisconsin dairy farmers out of business because they can't compete with $5 a hundredweight milk. Well, nobody can, for that matter. So it had nothing at all to do with us, and a lot more to do with Michigan, Trump's tweets anyway. So it's in a dire spot. They're losing, the dairy farmers in Wisconsin told me they'd lost more than a farmer a day in 2016. More than 400 farmers have gone out of business. Dairy farmers have gone out of business in Wisconsin. This is all the same kind of thing. It's just a horrendous mess, basically, in the U.S., in the dairy sector. And again, this is what we're supposed to adopt here in Canada. And U.S. milk prices, these are all normalized for, the U.S. gallons, 3.8 liters. So when you normalize it for 4 liters and input the exchange rate, this was, I think, January 2017. When you look at the price, they have 8 regions in the U.S., and this is U.S. Bureau of Labor statistics. So the U.S. Bureau of Labor collects data on inflation, on commodity prices for 1 million commodities in the U.S. You can go online and look at the data because it's posted almost as soon as they collect it. So this isn't some raving lunatic kind of guy who does this, normalizes this kind of thing, but it's actually the U.S. Bureau of Labor, and its average retail food and energy prices, U.S. city average, and then whatever the region is. So every single region except the Midwest region, milk prices are cheaper in Canada than they are in the U.S. And if you go to a border Costco or Walmart and you buy cheap milk there, it's because the supermarket is, the farmer's taking the hit on that. The supermarket's gaining the benefit, and it bears no relationship at all to the cost of production. So in a sense, Canadians who buy milk in the U.S. are contributing to the devastation of the American dairy sector by buying that stuff. And I don't know, maybe if we ever did adopt got rid of supply management, of course we'd be swamped with American milk in very short space of time. That's what they're desperately anxious to do. Probably 2% of their production would pretty much suit our needs in Canada. But I would guess that we'd be paying, $4.84 or $5, whatever it is. We wouldn't get there would be no more milk sold at border Costco's, I would think, in the U.S. if we ever got rid of supply management. So it's the farmers that take the hit, and I think consumers should think about that every time they shop at the Bellingham Costco or the Buffalo Walmart or something like that. So anyway, there's significant issues that aren't going to disappear soon. Terrible. The international market is pretty nasty for the most part, I think, and unless you're there are lots of rubes out there, who take a bath on these kinds of, on treading into international waters on a regular kind of basis. So to conclude, it seems to me that we in Canada have the system we want for dairy, which is supply management and eggs as well. And in fact, both dairy producers and egg producers, I was at the Egg Farmers of Canada annual general meeting in Mont Tremblant a couple of years ago, and they actually invited one of the, and it's the same for dairy, the concept or the principle is the same for dairy. They invited the head of United Egg Producers that's based in Atlanta to come and talk. The egg guys between Canada and the US get along very, very well. So they have a really great relationship, unlike the dairy side of things. But this guy, Chad Gregory, said that good thing you have supply management, because if you didn't, we would clobber you. You know, and again, there's been a surplus of eggs in the US. Prices have reached 75 cents, or plummeted 75 cents a dozen for eggs in the US. And what he's saying, then if you guys didn't have supply management and import quotas and high tariffs after the tariff rate quota has been reached, then basically we would flood your market with shell eggs, of course, which is the lucrative part of that, or industrial eggs, or whatever kinds of eggs. Same thing would happen with milk. We'd have this huge tsunami of milk washing across the border between Canada and the United States if we ever got rid of supply management. And of course they do, not all farmers, and they're phasing it out in some jurisdictions, but there is a fair amount of growth hormone used in American milk. I think 42% of their exports now of dairy products have some trace of growth hormone in them, and something like 17% of American farmers use it. So we would lose our industry and rural sustainability and all sorts of other things that would follow from that. If we adopted the Australian system, same kind of thing. Again, it wouldn't work. Australia doesn't have, in fact, a couple of Australian dairy farmers had the wisdom, in a sense, I guess, to point out to me, well, if you guys didn't have that, then the Americans would simply swamp your market, right? And have to say, yeah, we think that would be the case. But the Australian system doesn't work. The only reason it works there is because they have no one around them. You know, if they had a US, they wouldn't be in operation either. Supermarkets as well, it seems to me that there's always a regulator of some kind. There's no such thing as a free market, even though we talk in those kinds of terms. So the supermarkets in Australia have become the regulator, or Fonterra in New Zealand has become the regulator. I should say too, just tangentially, for Fonterra it's a cooperative, and you have to buy shares in Fonterra if you want Fonterra to pick up your milk. You know, and shares now trade generally between $5 and $6, and a big farmer might have 1 million liters of 1 million shares, because that would translate into 1 million liters of pickup annually. So that's a $5 to $6 million investment. I asked a couple of those guys too, well, how is your system different from ours in terms of quota, you know, where it's $24,000 a kilogram? You guys are paying $5 to $6 million of, in a sense, quota costs to just, you focus on the international as opposed to the domestic. Anyway, they didn't really go for that. So I never got a right answer, I think. Anyway, supermarkets would look after their bottom line, and they become the regulators. You know, and Loblaws recently announced a 0.76% stocking charge. So that's what they charge to put someone's goods on their shelves. To maintain a viable industry and rural sustainability, producers, you know, I'm certainly speaking to the converted here, need sustainable prices, which other dairy systems don't provide at all. So supply management protects you guys from rapacious and unfair competition. You know, basically the Americans are discovering this, which is why they're so intent. Global situation is terrible. Why they want the Canadian market through the NAFTA renegotiation, which I actually don't think they're going to get. Our government is pretty foursquare in favor, I think, of supply management. But our market would represent profitability to their industry. Of course, if they get our market, if supply management disappears, then very quickly they'd increase production too much again, and we'd go through the same cycle all over again. As I say, this one, you know, remember the US Bureau of Labor numbers, would be an irony if milk in Canada actually rose in price after the Americans take over our market. And that's just a little shot close to where I live, of course, St. Jacobs, and it's a very nice tourist area. I'm sure nobody here you don't have to go to St. Jacobs, I'm sure, to see this. This isn't my photograph, but it was one online. So anyway, thanks a lot. And do you have any questions or comments or anything? I'm happy to talk about. There's a ton of stuff here. As I say, I've spent years talking to farmers in Australia and New Zealand in particular. So, and you're a captive audience at least for another 3 minutes.
Question here.
What do you think about Great Britain?
Oh, the UK is a total basket case in terms of dairy. In fact, they've gone down below 10,000 dairy farmers for the first time ever. Yeah, they've again, cost of production isn't being met, and the supermarkets operate on the same principles in the UK that they do, or in England as they do in Australia. So it's really, really horrible.
And a time, got a question? No? Oh, I'm here.
I was reading like on supply management in the U.S. It's a lot of them are kind of wanting to adopt the system, but how? Like obviously in Canada, supply management works. Farmers paid fairly. How would like a 30,000 cow dairy though fork out 24? How would that work? How could they implement a system even to reflect our system?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we don't really have to worry about that because when I mentioned that kind of thing, I didn't say the 30,000 dairy farm to the guys in Wisconsin when I was talking to the Dairy Farmers Union there. But they said there's no chance of it ever being introduced in the U.S. And of course, it would have to be a national system to have any impact at all. But I don't, the whole point about supply management, I think, is it's to encourage rural, well, as it turns out, I don't think this was one of the original requirements, but it encourages rural sustainability through smaller farms. So I don't know what, I think it's the biggest Canadian farm, about 2,500 cows at Chilliwack Dairy Systems in BC, I think has 2,200 or 2,500 cows, but that's the real exception, I think. So it wouldn't work. That would be one heck of a lot of quota.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Always enlightening, and we really appreciate you defending supply management.
My pleasure.
You mentioned California a number of times. I understand that California just went through a vote for supply management. Do you have any insight on that, or?
A vote on supply management?
Yeah.
No. The short answer to that, and I guess the long answer too, is no. They did have They did have vote on, it was some sort of...
The farmers voted in December, so I just wondered if...
no, sorry, I don't...
It was extended from October or November, so...
No, well, it wouldn't work in California anyway. If it's just California, of course, it does have to be a national system in order to work. They did, I know that the only vote I know about in California is they had some animal welfare legislation, I think, that came down the pipe, but maybe it had to do with eggs. But the issue with bobby calves, too, of course, is one that's just animating more and more people, too, and probably one, I don't know if it's best not talked about, but you'll have to deal with it at some point, I think, what you do with male calves. And the day-old chicks business in the egg farms is another huge, huge issue that is rearing its ugly head, for sure.
Another one back here?
If I can chime in a bit, I think this is related to what I was going to ask, is that my understanding in California is they're currently, of course, going through a voting process to opt back into the federal orders program in the U.S., but which they opted out of to have free control of sales. We think of them being uncontrolled for export markets to the Pacific Rim, especially since about 2000. But what is lesser known, and this may be the confusion here, is my understanding is California has a fluid quota system that they've had for decades, in that this is part of the federal orders, and they just had a vote to retain that system under the federal orders. And so we talk about supply management, that the one state we think of the largest producer and the one that is sort of free production actually is under quota control and supply management for fluid. It's only the export side or the manufacturing side that is free from that.
No, well, I know a bit about the historical part of the milk marketing orders, and California had its own milk marketing order as opposed to the others, which were regional. But I don't know anything at all about that. I'll have to look into it.
They have a fluid quota system.
Well, I don't want to say that maybe they should let California farmers know about that. But they do anyway, yeah. I'll have to look into that, thanks.
Thanks for your presentation, Bruce. I think a lot of this isn't news to many of us here. Certainly we understand the importance of our system in protecting the livelihood and sustainability of our industry. I guess my question for you is there a take-home message to us about what more we can do to influence those who are going to make decisions about the dairy industry in Canada?
Yeah, I think this is a big issue for sure, and I know the egg farmers are going through it, sort of trying to consider what they can do. And what they have a really, and I think Dairy Farmers of Ontario, I'm not so sure about Dairy Farmers of Canada, but DFO has a really active sort of blogging, tweeting kind of, I guess it's not a department, but they have people who do that kind of thing, and I think that that is certainly a useful mechanism through which to get urban dwellers to follow a little bit about what happens on farms. Also, I think, again, it's very more difficult maybe for dairy farmers, but egg farmers often just will appear at a supermarket and they stand by the egg, well, I guess I was going to say they sometimes bring chickens in too, but they can't bring them into the supermarket. It'd be hard to bring a cow in, I'm sure. But they say that they're egg farmers, and that as soon as they say they're egg farmers, consumers in Vancouver or Toronto just go semi-nuts about that. You know, they say you're the farmer whose hens produce these eggs, and actually one guy told me that he stood by his eggs because they're branded through his farm in Vancouver to Safeway, at a downtown Safeway, and he'd say, yeah. And he said they would buy out all of his eggs, and they'd love to meet him. They actually like to tour his farm. He has open house on a fairly regular basis. And I think also that Roger Pellicero, who's the chair of the board of Egg Farmers of Canada, he has a farm by Smithfield in the Niagara region, and he actually invites busloads out to his farm, despite biosecurity measures, to look at how his hens are handled and dealt with and the kind of environment in which they live. And apparently that's had a fairly significant effect on some consumer attitudes. And of course you get one or two people who begin talking about it's not as bad as may be depicted in PETA websites, and that's all to the good. And I think absolutely you should talk to your political representatives, you know, whether they're Liberal or Conservative or NDP. I've been to Ottawa a couple of times. I've talked to a parliamentary committee once about this, and I talk to them on a fairly regular basis, to parliamentarians, and they are absolutely supportive. But I think it would have a huge impact if farmers actually did that on a fairly regular basis. I don't know if maybe DFO or DFC does that. Probably DFC does, but certainly to try and influence decision makers would be a really, really good thing, good way to go about this.
Two more, one here, one over there.
Hey, Bruce, thank you for your presentation. After decades of globalization, we're starting to see a swing towards protectionism in many countries. Do you see that continuing, for one, and what do you think China's impact will be on that?
I think that I don't know, what we see is with the NAFTA renegotiation now, of course, is the people talk about the swing to protectionism. I'm not so sure that all Americans are on side about that. And if we get a new president, maybe Trump will be president for life after this, I don't know. But if we get a new president, the country could easily swing back to supporting things like TPP and NAFTA. And I think certainly business in the US remains entirely supportive, and most of the states do as well. So it might be a bit of an overstatement to talk about protectionism in the US, although they certainly have done a couple of fairly egregious things like getting out of TPP, that was a pretty crummy agreement for us, for Canada, as far as it went. So it was a good thing they did that. I don't know that this whole free trade business, or freer trade business, I guess, has been part of Canadian policy since 1947, when the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was established. So it's not going to disappear. But I always think that the kind of trade we have now, which favors the corporate sector at the expense of everyone else. So if you're a corporation, you can actually go to Mexico and pay your workers $2 an hour to make cars, and there are no ramifications, there's no impediment to you doing that. You don't have to pay those workers more. So the kind of trade, these kinds of agreements we have now, maybe those days are limited because people are becoming upset with that. But the kind of free trade we had, I think, between 1947 and maybe 1988, when the Uruguay round started with the General Agreement, Those were good free trade agreements, I think. They had some sort of social conscience, and they actually had workers in mind when they reduced tariffs and various other things. Since the Uruguay round of the General Agreement, when we get the World Trade Organization in January of 1995, that was a whole different kind of thing, and I think the world has been much worse off as a result of that. So maybe that'll change, but and I hope it does, but the emphasis on freer trade, probably not.
All right, this is just a general comment. You talked about the ag producers, and my wife and I are layer and pullet quota holders. And since the cage-free push came in a few years ago, we've rebelled as ag farmers. We got together as a team, and you talked about that. But I think that's what we as farmers need to do, and not just in the dairy or poultry industries, but just unite, because our story's gone a long ways, and we've seen good success. You know, we were at the expansion mode. We put enriched cages in be a year ago this summer. Things are working well, but we've seen what's happened in California with their dairy and egg producers, and all the major marketers in California, the McDonald's, Walmarts, they've all rebelled but one, you know, back onto conventional or caged eggs, because the consumer's not paying the price.
Right.
They're the ones that are tired of seeing price increases, right? So we're hanging on. We're doing well. It's close. Like, I don't feel the pressure. We work the Royal Winter Fair, any local fairs. My wife's big into it. She drags me there, but I enjoy it because we don't get attacked. We get asked general questions like, as egg producers, difference between white and brown eggs. And I said this yesterday. It's not rocket science. But to the general consumer, they have no idea that they're the same egg.
But brown eggs are better, right?
Well, that's what they assume, right?
Right.
So we explain cost of production reflective to what they see on the store shelves, and there's an oodle of choices. We're not there to tell them one's better than the other. You know, it comes down to maybe what their heartstrings tell them they need to buy, or if there's a personal preference, right? But we don't get attacked over cages. We talk about it. We have them on display. It's not that bad. So I guess if we're looking for something to do, it's get out there and tell our story. We've opened up our barns. Our number one concern around our farm is biosecurity, but our second concern is getting people there to see it and
Right.
understand what's going on. They're not battery cages, you know, in our eyes is what people refer to them as. It's a house that's clean, it's safe, they've got feed and water, accessible. The eggs aren't laying in filth. It's all what we know, but a lot of people out there just don't get it. So if you've got time, get out, tell your story. It's a good story. We've all, you know, obviously we wouldn't be here if we didn't care, right? So it's a story that just I encourage more, because I learned a lot. The first exhibition fair in Toronto, you know, I had more questions about why we have to refrigerate eggs versus why our hens are in cages or houses. So anyways, that's just food for thought.
Yeah, I think farmers are your own best advocates on this, that people are prepared, you know, in public opinion polls, farmers rate right at the top of all of those, like 92% of Canadians think you're trustworthy and honorable and all that kind of stuff, which of course is the case. But I think if you say that X or Y is happening, then that generally is, people believe you, you know, and I think I realize this is a dairy crowd as opposed to eggs, but I think what the science says is this is the kind of thing that you have to deal with in dairy production as well, the equivalent kind of thing. What the science would say is that enhanced cages are the best environment. You can't use cage because then people think it's just a horrible kind of situation. But an enhanced cage is the best environment for raising eggs. You know, good for the chicken, good for the hen. They have a scratch pad and a nesting box sometimes and perches and all that kind of thing, and they have twice as much room. But also good for the consumer in terms of cost of production. And I think that you know, you get overtaken by animal rights groups and the Humane Society of the U.S. who raises issues, and the PETA people. And you know, I think that kind of thing is, if you let them tell your story, then you risk losing out. So you guys have much, much more credibility and a lot more support than anybody else almost in Canadian society. So you get out there and you tell your story. I think that's a really useful thing for you to do. And people like to see, you know, cows and hens and that kind of thing as well. So I don't know. It's a really tough. It's tough. The last thing I'll say about this is that, You know, in the US, lots of producers have switched over to free range or barn systems or aviary systems, whatever you want to call them, and they can't sell those eggs now. So people aren't paying the price. Same thing in Australia. When you go to Coles or Woolworths, the cage eggs, they still have caged eggs in Australia. About 50% of production is caged. And those eggs are always gone. The free range eggs aren't because people can't afford them. So again, it's a bit of a lesson, but I don't know what that leads to or why I said it, but anyway, I did, so it's out there. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bruce. I think a lot of positives coming out of that, but one of the bigger things is that last kind of open discussion that we had there and making us all think about talking to our friends and neighbors and even opening up our doors. Events such as the Open Farm Days are great opportunities to get our urban neighbors in and show them what we're doing. So I think that's everything for the day. One final note is any garbage that you happen to have brought to your seats, please take it out with you just to help with cleanup at the end of it.
Thanks to you.
Oh, thank me. See y'all.